the majority of this lecture, we're going to focus on natural species, so not humans, and the ways that natural species exist in their ecosystems or the places that they live. So ecology, again, as I said, is a really big picture biology. It includes everything. It includes the interactions between living things and non-living things. So when we're talking about those interactions, we're talking about the relationships that we have with precipitation, water, that helps to fuel producers, water, sunlight, carbon dioxide, non-living or what we call abiotic factors, with living things like producers, those that photosynthesize, and how we rely on those producers to produce food for us. We'll talk about a lot of other abiotic factors, but we have a lot of interactions. One of the most obvious ones is that process of photosynthesis, fueling ecosystems, that producers produce food that are eaten by primary consumers or herbivores, and herbivores are eaten by secondary or tertiary consumers. When everything dies, the decomposers break down the last bits of energy in living things, and then they also break down the bonds or the energy. They take that energy and they make the nutrients or the atoms available to the rest of the ecosystem in soil and air and water that then goes back into the system through the producers. So, you've taken biology before. What does it mean? So give yourself a second to read over the choices. If you flip to the next page, that question is on the next page. So if you're not on page 2, flip to page 2. You've got these choices. Is biology the study of Earth, the study of animals, the study of natural processes, the study of non-living things, or the study of living things? Which one do you all think it is? Good, okay. So this L-O-G-Y, when you see that, it means the study of. So like psychology, the study of the psyche or the mind. Zoology, it's the study of animals. Zoo, right? You find those things in a zoo. Bio, B-I-O means living. The study of living things. We're going to see this term BIO pop up a lot in this class. Anytime you see it, now you can remember that this is referring, whatever we're talking about with bio, abiotic, biotic potential. When you see BIO, you're focused on living. So ecosystem ecology, we've got a bunch of different kind of levels of ecology that we look at depending on what we're studying. Ecosystem ecology, it encompasses the abiotic factors, non-living things. So when you have, again, look at, you have that BIO in there, right? So we know BIO means living, but then this says it's non-living. The A in biology, when you use the word A, it means the following thing is not. So, or non. A means non, bio, living. So when we're talking about abiotic factors in an environment, we're talking about the A, non-bio living things, the non-living things. Are non-living things important or critical to the success of living things in ecosystems? Yeah, right? Water. We know that if we get dehydrated, what that does, it doesn't allow us to make and break molecules. The atmosphere has oxygen in it. We need oxygen to fuel the process of cellular respiration. So just thinking about carbon dioxide, oxygen, water, those things make photosynthesis and cellular respiration go round and round. Photosynthesis and cellular respiration are two critical processes for the success of life on the planet. The interaction, so ecosystem ecology, is the interaction between non-living things and living things. The abiotic and the biotic, the way they interact, the way they have a relationship with one another, or they interact with one another. So that's what we call ecosystem ecology. We take in all the factors in an ecosystem. So why do we study ecosystem ecology? So again, as I mentioned before, that researchers are interested in studying this particular field because a lot of those abiotic factors are often limited resources. We don't have a forever amount of them. With climate change happening and affecting photosynthetic organisms by destroying places like the rainforest or the coral reefs that have a lot of primary producers, if we destroy them, then we are destroying the organisms who can take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Otherwise, it's just sitting in there, right? And the more carbon dioxide, hopefully you know the connection, temperatures go up. Makes climate change accelerate. The photosynthesizers are becoming limited resources in the world, but everything relies on them for food and for extracting carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to make oxygen. Oxygen and food get funneled into cellular respiration, the way that organisms process their food. So as we have an effect and photosynthesizers become a limited resource, what's going to happen to the rest of the organisms on the earth? People are studying that. Other limited resources they might study is nitrogen, for example. They might study water, becomes a very limited resources in places that are affected by climate change where they have drought. We saw in Maui. Maui's always been very lush, but Maui, because of climate change, has become drier and made it susceptible to fires. They've never had wildfires on Maui before, and look what it did. So again, ecosystem ecology, studying the biotic and the abiotic factors to figure out, are there limited resources that we should be focusing on, maybe making more unlimited once again. We're going to look at the basics of population ecology, population biology or population ecology, we can say both. Today, we're going to look at these 4 factors, and these 3 we're referring to natural populations, and then we're going to get into humans, because humans can defy nature or natural processes in ways that other organisms cannot. So a little bit about a population. A population are all the members of a species that live in the same place at the same time. Species, the term species means that organisms that are the same species and live in the same place at the same time can interbreed. The word breed is in there. Inter means with self or within the group. So the group can breed. If you have a population that is so stressed out by limited resources, by trying to get them, they will not have time to breed. The next unit we're going to talk about evolution. A huge driving factor of evolution is populations breeding. You can only evolve if you are passing on a new generation and a new generation and a new generation. So breeding in ecology is really important to keep our populations growing. It is also important in evolution to keep our populations evolving or changing based on the current environment. So remember that a population are organisms of the same kind that can have offspring. And when we're talking about interbreeding, we're also talking about successful breeding. And what that means is that organisms can have offspring who also are fertile and can have offspring, so that they can keep passing on the DNA or the genes to the next generation and the next generation and the next generation. Today we're going to focus on population ecology and look at what happens with the environment that allows organisms of the same kind, same species, to grow or change over time. And we'll look at kind of like, we'll get into the hows and whys. First, we're just going to talk about how they grow, how they may expand or shrink in size, and we'll talk about the whys in a little bit. So we're going to talk about 2 things. The hows are what we would call the biotic potential. Biotic, B-I-O. Potential means the ability of living things to grow in size as a population. And the why they grow or why they stop growing or why they shrink, we're going to talk about environmental resistance. So the how, biotic potential, and the why is environmental resistance. So those are two things we're going to focus on in terms of how populations grow. Population growth is influenced by three main factors: by how many individuals are born, how many die, and who comes in and out, what we call migration. Again, humans are really different in terms of these three things because with births, we have medical teams to help us. If you're a giraffe and you live out in the African savannah and you just plop your offspring onto the ground and it's dirty, and what does that offspring have to do? It's got to get up and run because there could be a lion right there. And the parent has to help. So we can help this, we can prolong this with medicine, and we can take planes and boats and cars around the world. So we don't fit this natural idea of growth and shrinking. So we're going to focus on the natural. So migration, a little bit about migration. There's two forms of migration. There's immigration. Immigration are those that join a population. Again, they're the same species though. So like out on the prairie, there might be voles, little like kind of mousy looking creatures. They're bigger. And the vole population could be that, let's say a mile away, there's a fire. And those that live a mile away, normally those voles on our prairie don't interact with them. But because of the fire, some of them will immigrate to the population on our prairie. So those would be immigrants. Let's say our prairie has a fire and they leave and they go to another area in Palos Hills. We would call them emigrants. If you leave your area and you join the same species in a different area, you are emigrating. You're leaving your population and you're going to a new population. In natural populations, migration doesn't have an enormous influence until climate change comes into play. Because with climate change, we see a lot more immigration and emigration of natural species because places are getting really dry, they're getting overrun with flooding, water, fires. So we see species moving a lot more than we ever have before. Populations are stable when the amount of births and deaths are about equal and the amount of immigrants and emigrants are equal. So you have the same number joining the population as you do leaving the population. And joining and leaving does include those that are born and those that die. So we're going to do a little calculation of our population and see how much it changes from year to year. Population gets larger if the births and the immigrants outnumber the deaths and the immigrants. Those that join, they're more than those that leave. And the converse is true. Populations get smaller if you have more deaths and immigrants than you have births and immigrants. So if any of you go on to become population ecologists or conservationists and you're studying natural populations, while we've said in the past that we usually ignore migration, you might find that we can't ignore it anymore because of the movement caused by climate change. So, annual growth rate, we're going to mainly focus on births and deaths, but again, in the future, you might be also adding in those immigrants and emigrants. So, one of the things that we're looking at, the main factors, you're going to take the amount of births, subtract the amount of deaths, and then you're going to add in the amount of immigrants and the amount of, immigrants minus the immigrants. So So births minus deaths plus immigrants minus immigrants. You would calculate this first, and then this, and then add those two numbers together, and that'll tell you your change in population size from, depends on what your population is doing. If you're looking at insects, you might do it from month to month. They're smaller, they can reproduce faster. If you're looking at elephants, you might do it from year to year because they have a much longer reproductive cycle. So natural population increase. Births and deaths are, again, more significant, but we might see that we want to focus a little bit more in modern times on the immigrants and the immigrants. So what influences births and deaths? Here's that biotic potential I mentioned before. BIO, living things, and the potential of those living things to grow in size from month to month, year to year, decade to decade. Biotic potential usually has a maximum amount of births and a minimum amount of deaths, because if you have the potential to really start growing, you might have a population that moves to a new area where there's no limited resources. You've got everything you need. You've got space, and you've got food, and you've got lots of nutrients. And so you move to this area and everybody's like making their homes and they're doing their jobs and they're eating and they're reproducing because everything is stable. They're not stressed out about limited resources. So that might give them a lot or a maximum, the best amount of potential for births. And if you're a new population, maybe you don't have a lot of older individuals, and you have a minimum amount of deaths. You also have a minimum amount of deaths because you're not fighting for limited resources. If I told you all, oh, by the way, in this class, I only give out 1 A and the rest of you get Fs. Do you think that it would stress you out a lot more? Do you think that there would be a lot more competition in class, right? And so that A is a limited resource. And so when we're talking about like this idea of biotic potential, is the more available resources make for this situation of biotic potential. For you to have lots of babies because you're not stressed out, because you have everything you need, and then you can focus on reproducing and taking care of your young. You don't have a lot of young dying because there's a lot of resources. You don't maybe have a lot of older individuals, or you might have also that if you have an unlimited amount of resources, that the population takes care of their older individuals in the population. They can live a lot longer because they're not stressed out either. Environmental resistance. These are the things where the resources start to become limited. You start to grow and grow and grow and grow. For example, space. If you move into a new area and you're just reproducing and reproducing and reproducing, are you going to run out of space eventually? Yeah, probably. So space is a really huge factor, that's one of the limitations of space. The other thing is that if you start to get really crowded, there's only so much food available. Eventually food becomes a limited resource. You compete for limited resources. You're a bigger population, so predators can see you. There might be more diseases that are passed around because you're getting crowded. There's a lot more dead things around. Natural events, all those climate change factors, and then also your genetics. Do you have the ability to adapt or live on all of these natural resources when things get rough? Are you good genetically? So environmental resistance counteracts biotic potential. You grow, 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 and then eventually, bam, environmental resistance kicks in, and that could do really bad things to your population, or your population gets here and they're like, whoa, 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 things are getting uncomfortable. Let's slow down on the reproduction. Let's just slow down. Let's be more mindful of all of these issues, and let's start to level out where environmental resistance starts to make us uncomfortable. So you have a couple things that can happen, and a lot of that may depend on how bad it is a natural event that you encounter while encountering all of this stuff, And what are your genetics? Do you have individuals in the population or groups in the population that are favored when things change? So when we're talking about these two things, we're talking about how populations grow and why they either continue to grow or they start to level off or they shrink. So here's your how and your why. All right, so generally, again, I mentioned this before, migration, we might ignore it, but we might not. Population sizes are determined upon changes for individuals in a unit of time, per month, per year. If we're looking at bacteria, we could be doing per minute because they can reproduce very quickly, per hour. How much are you contributing in a set amount of time as an individual? Are you having a lot of offspring? Are you not? What we look at is we look at the growth rate of a population. So from that unit of time, seconds, minutes, months, years, how much is your population growing? What we call that is we call that italicized little r. That little r is composed of a calculation of your birth rate, not just births, but the rate per unit time of the births in the population, and you subtract the death rate or the deaths per unit time in that population. So growth rate, R, is B minus D. Again, remember these are all lowercase and they're in italics. So let's take an example. We're going to look at the growth rate of mice per year. Our population size is 10,000 originally. We have 500 deaths in that first year and 1,500 births. So now we have to figure out a rate. When we're talking about rate, we're talking about percentage. So we have to figure out 500 divided by the original population size gives us our death rate, and 1,500 divided by our original population size gives us our birth rate. And we're going to subtract birth rate minus death rate. So if we take our birth rate, 1,500 individuals, we again divide that by 10,000. Our birth rate is 0.15. If we make that a percentage, we take 0.15 times 100% to get what is our percentage here, and that equals 15%. So that's our birth rate. So just to understand that when we're looking at this 0.15 births per mouse per year, we also can say there's a 15% birth rate by converting this decimal to a percentage. Our death rate, we said that it's 500 divided by 10,000, so we get 0.5 deaths per mouse per year. What percent is this? Good, 5%. You can also, when you times something by 100, you move the decimal place 1, 2 places. All right, so calculate out. Take your birth rate minus your death rate and tell me what is our population increase for the first year. Give yourself a second to calculate that out. You should be able to do this just in your heads. So what's our growth rate? What's R? Yeah, good. So our growth rate is 10%. Take 15% minus 5%, and that gives us 10%. 0.15 minus 0.05 gives you 0.10 times 100%, remove 1, 2 decimal places, and that's 10% population growth per year. Do you think a 10% growth in the population is a pretty good amount of growth? Think about the human population. If we have 8 billion people on the earth, and we take 10% of that. Is that significant? Yeah. So it's pretty significant, 10%, even though 10% doesn't sound like much, right? If you went somewhere and they said, we'll give you a 10% discount, you might be like, that doesn't even cover tax. But it's something. When you're talking about populations, it's pretty good. The original population size, we're gonna call that italicized capital N. That's population size. Our original population size was 10,000. Oh, sorry. And then population growth, we're going to take our R that we calculated out, our 10% times our original population size. If you remember, our original population size was 10,000 times 10%. We're going to figure out now how many individuals exactly did we add with a 10% population growth of 10,000. So our N for the first year is what? Right, so we grew by 1,000 individuals. So what's our new N in the second year? We're going to take 10,000 and add 1,000 individuals, right? So our new N, our new population size, is 11,000. 10%, our R, or our growth rate that we calculated, times 10,000, gives us 1,000 new mice in that first year. We're going to add this, add our new mice to our original amount of mice, gives us a new N. So what is our, we take our 11,000 times our 10%. In the second year now, how many individuals have we added? So take our 10% times your 11,000, our new population number. How many individuals have we added in the second year? Yeah, good. So C, 1,100. So here you can see if we had 1,100 as our second year N, our N for our second year would be 10%, 0.10, times 11,000, which gives you 1,100 more individuals. So just in 2 years, we've added 2,100 individuals. That's a lot. And you could continue this on. Eventually you might recalculate your RN. If you're starting to see, if you're an ecologist and then you're like, I'm starting to see that we're adding individuals a lot faster, maybe you want to recalculate R, or if you're starting to see the numbers going down, you're seeing a lot more deaths or competition, you might want to go back and recalculate this. So as an ecologist, you would make those rules of when you're going to recalculate R through the process. So eventually, if we're adding 1,000, 1,100, 1,300, 1,500, what we're doing is we're making our population go up, up, up. And at some point, you get to this just sweet spot where you go, whew, and your population really shoots up. We call that rapid exponential growth. Your population is rapidly growing at an exponential rate. It's just accelerating and accelerating and accelerating in size. If you graph this, what it's going to look like is a J. Your population's growing, 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 and then shoots up. So that, you guys would see it like this, right? Growing, 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 and then it shoots up. That's a letter J. So here, if we were looking at bacteria, summer's coming to a close, and we're heading into the fall, and we have a lot of changes that happen, and the air gets a lot drier, and then we have a lot of things that people cough, and they float in the air, and we get each other sick. One of the things that people might cough out is strep bacteria. So if you are susceptible to strep throat, I am not. I could just do a little cough and a little bacteria could float in the air and you could breathe it in. And if you are susceptible to getting sick from that particular bacterium, it will start to undergo this process of biotic potential, of exponential growth. So bacterium Depends on a lot of things. Different bacteria will reproduce at different rates. And so here we've got 3 different scenarios. What might happen is, here you are in a day, and you start out the day, and you're feeling good, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I'm starting to feel a little off, right? Ever have that day where you're just like, oh no. And then by the hours, you just start getting worse and worse and worse. That's because the bacteria are reproducing and reproducing and reproducing. So 2 go into 4, 4 go into 8, 8 go into 16, and we have this exponential biotic potential happening. Now, how quickly you have those symptoms will depend on a number of things. If it takes about 3.5 hours to produce this many bacteria, it's not going to be as fast as a population that takes 4 hours to produce the same. And maybe it'll be a couple days or 6 days before you really start to feel badly if it takes about 5.5 hours to make 1,500 new bacteria. So that rate of reproduction will make a big difference in how fast you will see these J-shaped curves evolve. If we look at a bigger time scale and we're looking at 2 different species of eagles, what we might see is that population 1, this species of eagle, the red, it can reproduce at 4 years old. So at the age of 4, these in the species of eagle, they can begin to have their own offspring. This other population, the blue, they can't until age 6. And so it's going to take them a lot longer to achieve this biotic potential, as opposed to them, they have a quicker biotic potential. So that age when you can first reproduce is very critical to seeing what happens or when you start to see that shooting up, or that arm of the J. All right, let's go back. What was R again? What was it? Which one of these? Was that the original population size, population growth, growth rate, migration, environmental resistance? Yeah, so just remember, R is the growth rate, N is the original population size. So again, don't forget, growth rate, R, is your birth rate minus your death rate. Just a little review. Growth rate, R, is B minus D. Review. Remember that you have exponential growth when your births and your immigrants far exceed your deaths and your immigrants. Could just take one offspring in a lifetime to make this biotic potential start to shoot up. You see that exponential growth curve J. Okay, there are a bunch of factors that will affect when biotic potential kicks in for a population. So we've got a number of things. One, as we mentioned, age of first reproduction. Whether it's 20 minutes, 40 minutes, 60 minutes for bacterium, if it's 4 years or 6 years for eagles. Oh, sorry, that was weird. The first one is fecundity. Excuse me, I don't know why that came up second. Fecundity means, do you have good genes? Are you highly evolved? Are you favored by natural selection based on having the genetics that allow you to succeed in the current environment? Having good genes or traits, given the current environment that your population is living in, is called fecundity. It allows you to have an easier time reproducing. The whole idea of fecundity, what makes you better at reproducing given that time, is that your genes are selected for by nature. This is what natural selection is. Natural selection is when nature, the current environment, favors the genetics that you have. When you are favored, you have less competitors. You don't compete as much because you're just like, things are easy for you to get, to have, to do. That gives you time to reproduce. We see a lot of evolution. Evolution is an underlying theme of biology, a lot of biology, and we see the changes daily. You can read the news and you can see new discoveries all the time based on organisms and what genes or traits are favored. Fecundity takes all of that and allows you an easier time surviving so that you can spend time reproducing. You pass on those beneficial genes given the current environment to the next generation. Sorry, second one, age of first reproduction. Third one, reproduction frequency. If you're a bacterium and you reproduce every 20 minutes, you're going to make that individual sick really quickly. As opposed to if you're a bacterium and you reproduce every 6 hours, it's going to take weeks or days for that person to get sick. What's your reproductive lifespan? Do you only have 5 years? Do you have 10 years? Do you have 80 years? Some sea turtles can reproduce for almost 100 years. So they can add a lot to the population. And how many offspring do you have? Do you have 1? Do you have 2 or 3? Can you have 200? Sea turtles can produce clutches of eggs of 200 at a time. So just in that one reproductive cycle, you could have a lot of offspring. Doesn't mean they'll survive. Because if we're talking about sea turtles, while they can have a lot, the majority of them are going to get eaten by fish and birds and foxes, and they are going to bake in the sun. Humans are going to block them from getting to the ocean. So there's a lot of reasons that even though you might have a lot, how many of them actually survive? So biotic potential can continue for a really long time, but at some point, resources become limited. So here's a graph of what happens in our area to many species because we have seasons. Because we have, for example, nutrients, which include water, oxygen, sunlight, all of these things become limited as we get into this time of year. So let's start at the beginning of the year. It's cold, right? Cold, water is locked up. Water is either hanging out in the clouds and it's not coming down as precipitation, or if it does come down, it's frozen and it's very hard to access. So we have a low amount of a limited resource, right? Water, really important for photosynthesis, really important for hydration, really important for cellular respiration. So we have a low amount of that. But it starts to rain around here at the beginning of the summer here. So we get a lot of these rains. And so when you have a lot of rain, what that does, it also makes the ground, and then you got rain and you have warming temperatures. And nutrients in the ground that were kind of frozen because it was cold, they become accessible. You've got water, you've got nutrients, you've got the carbon dioxide, and the photosynthesizers start to take off, and they start to grow a lot. And once they start to take off, then all of the consumers will start to take off. And so you have this really nice J-shaped curve or biotic potential of many organisms in our area of the world in the spring and through midsummer. Late summer, say late summer, right? This time of year. This time of year, not this week, it's gonna be hot, but let's say next week it starts to really cool off. And so then the temperatures are starting to go down, it's not going to rain as much because the heat makes the precipitation cycle go, evaporation, precipitation, and so it's getting cooler, so we're not having as much water coming down. And so the producers, the food starts to decrease, which means that you have competition for the limited resource of food, so that your consumers start to decrease. and then eventually it gets really cold, and those resources, the nutrients in the ground, get locked up because they're cold, they're not accessible. Water, we either have it in very limited amounts, or we have it as snow and ice, and it's hard to access. And so then again, these guys all level out at a low level, and you have this cycle of what we call a boom. Boom! Everything explodes, bust, down. And you have this on a very yearly basis. What makes the bust start to happen? All those things that I mentioned that start to decrease and become areas of great competition, it's environmental resistance. So here you have growth is the biotic potential, and when growth gets hindered, that's caused by environmental resistance. These are the two influences of population, ecology, and growth. Could be that it takes longer. So in a different area of the world, if we're looking at these reindeer, the reindeer, we might have looked at them over a course of 50 years. And what we saw is that in 1910, they came to a new area and growth took off. Maybe something happened here at about 1923. Maybe there was a disease that caused some of them to die. And then things are good again, they recover, and somewhere about 1930 to 35, you have that really good biotic potential. But then they run out of room. Look how crowded it is. Could you live in this for a long period of time? Just wall to wall with another species? No, right? Do you think a lot of fighting happens? Oh yeah, I would get annoyed. Stop touching me, right? Then you would, some of them will get like really aggressive and bite each other and cause disease. And they die that way. Or how do you have an offspring? How do you protect an offspring from this mass of adults? If everybody starts moving and your offspring, could it get trampled? Yeah, your young could get trampled, right? Can you feed everybody in this area? Not everybody's gonna get fed. What if you have predators? They just randomly come and grab because you're easy to see. So there's a lot of environmental resistance that kicks in. This population crashed almost to extinction. So they had this really great growth cycle for 40 years almost, and then within 10 years, they almost went extinct. So things can change really quickly. There's 3 scenarios that can happen in terms of your response to environmental resistance. So as a population, one, like the reindeer, maybe you get extremely damaged by this environmental resistance, and you either completely die off in that area, or you die off and you just have like a few left and you're trying really hard to rebound. So it can be really bad. The second thing that can happen is that, okay, things get really bad, and then just before you're about to go extinct, your group gets it together, maybe they move to a new area, they rebound, and they're like, well, let's not grow to here anymore, because that was like really ugly. Let's grow to here, and let's level off at a place that we can exist for a really long time, and everybody can be comfortable. What we call this leveling off at a point where everybody can exist and be comfortable is called the carrying capacity. The amount of individuals in a population that can be supported or carried for a long period of time. It's not zero growth, but it hovers around a number where if you take the average over time, these little bit of ups and downs, you get this average amount of population growth or size over a long time. The most adaptive organisms do this. They have this, woo, yeah, let's grow. And then they start to feel uncomfortable, and they're like, whoa, everybody slow down, so that we don't have this huge crash. Or a huge crash and then have to work to just get at a lower number. Some populations, when they start to feel the discomfort by environmental resistance, they start to level off at a carrying capacity. that can be maintained for a long period of time. So you've got really, really bad scenario, not so bad that you die off scenario, but you're really low in population number, or you've got the most ideal scenario where you have that biotic potential, and then you just start to level off at an average number where most individuals in the population can live comfortably. So the carrying capacity, the maximum amount of individuals in a population that can be supported in that environment for a long, long, long period of time. Think about the words that you're presented with, right? Carrying capacity, the maximum amount capacity, right? If we had in this room, we have a capacity of 32 students. If we have more than that, then there's people standing or people like 3 people at a desk. It starts to get uncomfortable. So capacity is like a maximum amount. Carrying, how many can we carry for a long period of time? So one of the nice things about biology is that you can like kind of think about the words a little bit. It gives you clues to what they mean. Carrying capacity is determined by environmental resistance, space, nutrients, predators, competition, natural events. Environmental resistance stops or slows biotic potential. Exponential growth is characteristic of having very little environmental resistance. So you're just like, you've got everything. You've got space, you've got water, you've got sunlight, you've got tons of producers that you're going to eat. You don't have much disease. You don't have predators that are spotting you. You don't have climate change happening. Little environmental resistance makes good biotic potential. Little awfulness. You don't have a lot of awful things. You're living large. So again, here's that yearly cycle that we see in our area due to seasons, is that we've got this low amount of growth, then we get this when environmental conditions are good in the spring. We've got that really nice J-shaped curve occurs, exponential growth, but then environmental resistance kicks in the beginning of the fall, and your population goes down. Carries on at a level that it can maintain over the course of the winter, so that eventually the next year, your population can grow back. Okay. And then you might see that over time, that you might have some populations that experience that boom and bust in cycles. So that every, say, 5 years, they go exponential growth, bust, exponential growth, bust, exponential growth, bust, exponential growth, bust, exponential growth. And so, like us, how we're on a yearly cycle, these little lemmings, these little rodents, they're on like a 5-year cycle. Also notice that with the research that was done on this, as climate change has accelerated over time, look at their booms are getting less and less over time. Okay, so let's talk about environmental resistance more. Environmental resistance counteracts or acts against biotic potential. It's going to slow it down or stop it. Environmental resistance has a huge effect on population size and growth. Two options, right? You crash, and then you crash and you completely die off, or you begin to stabilize at your natural carrying capacity or at a lower carrying capacity. So that stabilization goes with that carrying capacity. The maximum, the number of individuals can be supported by the environment at this given time. Most populations will experience exponential growth. Even a little bit of a J is a J, right? A little bit of that exponential growth, regardless if it's like or it's like but the limits get reached by environmental resistance. All right, so some of the environmental resistance, we mentioned like water, food, space, nutrients, parasitism, diseases. With climate change, we're seeing diseases spread quicker and faster to new areas because warm temperatures allow many of these little parasites to grow or spread easier. We also see that crowding might cause emigration, massive amounts of emigration. On Maui, animals that lived in an area that went on fire started to move. Some of the things that can happen is that immigrants can make new populations in other areas. Maybe they're affected that they die at a younger age because of the stress or the limited resources, the competition. Could also be that conditions are so bad that individuals aren't reproducing at all because all they're doing is fighting to get food and water and space. So stabilization occurs when a population begins to level out. When environmental resistance kicks in so much that they're like, ooh, this is uncomfortable. Let's slow it down. Carrying capacity can vary from year to year too. Just depends on what's happening in your environment. Did you have any natural disasters this past year that may have altered what happened last year? Are things harder this coming year? Maybe things are easier. So carrying capacity from year to year, one year it could be like here, the next year it could be down here, and the next year it could be up here. So just depending on what happens at that environmental resistance and biotic potential crux will depend on where your carrying capacity levels off. Now, when we're talking about carrying capacity, there's usually like an equilibrium. And it doesn't mean that your population, it does this boom, and then it always levels off at 1 million individuals. It means that maybe in the first few months you go up to 1.5 million, it starts to get crowded, competition, diseases, and then you go down to like 1 million, and then the next maybe 3 months later, you're at like 1.2 million, and then you go down to 1.1 million, and then you go up to 1.3 million. And so over time, it's that average over time. Rarely do you see a species that's just like, nope, this is the maximum amount we could have. It's not like this room where I could only allow a certain amount of individuals in. It doesn't work that way in the natural world. So zero population growth is like an over time average of what you're seeing in that population. It's a calculation that's done for a long amount of time that takes into account year to year the ups and downs and gives you an average over time. And that average over time, when you see that you don't have on average a lot coming in or going out, then you're at that stability. It's a good place to be. Typically this is true of very long-lived organisms like elephants, for example. Giraffes. And when they come to a new area. What we call this is type 1 survivorship. We'll talk more about these characteristics of survivorship. That's what we're going to look at in lab today as well. As we mentioned before, when we graph this, graph goes and it has that J shape, and then it starts to level out, and it looks like an S. So it starts to go up and then it levels out. You get more of an S shape. So it's the J with a leveling out, which makes it then look like an S. This is what we call a logistic curve. So you've got the J exponential curve and you've got the S logistical curve. So here again, got nice biotic potential happening, environmental resistance kicks in. Over time, they hover at about 0 population growth over a long period of time, or what we call the carrying capacity. So remember that here, the J, when we're looking at an S-shaped curve, the J is the biotic potential, and where it levels out is caused by environmental resistance. Carrying capacity is the maximum amount of individuals who can be supported for an indefinite or really, really, really long period of time. Environmental resistance includes renewable resources, things that are replenished naturally, like water, sunlight. You've got evaporation and precipitation is always happening. Is something wrong?
Oh, that, okay. Is it the wrong order?
Yeah.
So sometimes
Okay.
we'll go to
I like work on these all the time. And I make mistakes, I'm sorry. Okay, thanks, sorry. All right, so renewable resources are a part of environmental resistance, like water, sunlight, carbon dioxide, combine to make food, which also make available inorganic nutrients, and so these things are renewable though. Sun keeps going up and coming down, well, it doesn't go anywhere, but we keep spinning, I should say. Water goes up and down, food is made. We have nutrients are available through the process of decomposition. And so all of these things cycle. These are renewable. We know they're going to come back. Non-renewable resource, space. At some point in a natural population, you're just out of space. As I mentioned, humans, this doesn't apply to us in general because we can just build. We can make huge structures to put more individuals in a smaller amount or a smaller area. That's why we have cities. All right, so environmental resistant factors, they fall into 2 main categories. Density independent. Density means amount. And these factors, it doesn't matter how big your population is. So in Maui, since this happened recently, doesn't matter how many individuals were in that fire, everybody who didn't get out died. Doesn't matter if you had 2 in that area of your population or you had 100,000. You're both affected in that area by that environmental resistance factor. So it doesn't matter, density independent, doesn't matter how big you are going to be harshly affected. Density dependent means that the bigger you are, the worse it is. So if you have a lot of individuals in a population, like remember that picture of the reindeer? There were so many of them. If you are a wolf or a pack of wolves, do you have to work really hard to get food if there's just tons of them? No, you just go to that area and be like, yum, yum, yum. Easy, right? But if you're a pack of wolves and there's not many deer, do you have to go hunt for them and look for them, spend a lot of energy and time? So, for example, the predator-prey relationship is density dependent. The more prey, the easier it is for predators. The less prey, the harder it is for predators. All right, so density independent factors are usually like weather. Over time, organisms have adapted or they have become favored via natural selection to have genes that favor them in the current environment. So we have a lot of adaptations over time that have changed. You see characteristics that have changed over time with changing weather. But then these stupid humans, they mess it all up. So weather's a really big density independent factor, and so are humans, because of our influences of climate change, but also habitat loss. We could come in and let's say that our beautiful prairie out there, the college is like, well, there's a lot more people coming to the college, so we need to make that a prairie. Doesn't matter how many individuals are in that area, we're gonna destroy the habitat and they're all going to die off. So things like climate change, habitat destruction go with this too, with density independent factors. Other things that we use, humans, pesticides. Pollution has a big effect, a negative effect on all organisms.